The Clarity Act cleared the House over a year ago. It's been sitting in the Senate since. This week, it cleared the Banking Committee with bipartisan support, and three people who actually talked to senators, Scaramucci, Haggerty, and Coinbase's Brian Armstrong, are all independently pointing to the same window: a floor vote before the end of July. Meanwhile, Illinois just signed its own crypto tax into law, and that one has nothing to do with what the Senate does. This isn't financial advice, just educational content. Do your own research before making financial decisions. If this kind of breakdown is useful, hit like. Start with what the Clarity Act actually is, because market structure bill doesn't mean much on its own. It's roughly 400 pages trying to answer three questions the industry has been stuck on for years: what legally counts as a security versus a commodity versus something else entirely, how exchanges can list these assets without running afoul of securities law, and which federal regulator, the SEC, the CFTC, or some combination of the two, actually has jurisdiction. Those sound like technical questions, they're not minor. Without answers, every exchange, every fund, every custody provider operates with open-ended legal risk on its books. And pension funds and insurance companies generally won't tolerate that kind of ambiguity, regardless of how much they like the underlying asset. Senator Bill Haggerty drew a comparison this week that's worth taking seriously on its own terms. He authored the Genius Act, the stablecoin legislation that passed before the Clarity Act reached the floor. That bill created a legal framework for a reserve digital dollar backed dollar for dollar by short-term Treasury securities, which is what let the U.S. credibly claim it's staying ahead on digital payments rather than ceding that ground elsewhere. His argument is that the Clarity Act does the same thing for the rest of the digital asset market that the Genius Act already did for stablecoins. That's not a hypothetical comparison. The Genius Act is a working template you can actually point to and see what changed once the legal framework existed. As of May 21st, here's exactly where the bill sits. It passed the House over a year ago. It just cleared the Senate Banking Committee with votes from both parties, which is genuinely harder to get right now than it sounds. What hasn't happened yet is the full Senate floor vote. That's the remaining step. To get there, it needs 60 votes to survive a filibuster, which means Republicans alone can't do it. They need at least 7 Democratic senators. Cody Carbone, who's tracked this process closely, said this week the safer number is closer to 10 to build in a margin in case any Republican senators just don't move, regardless of what their voters think, or have financial ties to institutions that would rather this clarity never arrive. Brian Armstrong weighed in with a lower key but still notable raid. The bill came out of committee with bipartisan backing. It's already passed the House, and his hope is a floor vote within the next month or so, followed by a presidential signature a few months after that. He described the bill as a real expansion of the addressable market for Coinbase and crypto broadly, capital that currently can't legally enter under regulated conditions. When the CEO of the largest U.S. crypto exchange frames a bill that specifically, it's worth noting, even if you discount for the fact that he obviously benefits from it passing. The reason there's real urgency behind all of this, rather than just patience, comes down to the midterms. If Democrats take back the House, committee control shifts to chairs who've already voted against this bill. By most accounts, that means Maxine Waters and Elizabeth Warren in the relevant seats. Every finalist considered for the House committee chairmanship in that scenario voted no the first time around. In that world, this specific version of the bill is dead, and the industry isn't looking at a few more months of waiting. It's looking at years before another comparable legislative window opens. That's the actual stakes behind the July deadline everyone keeps repeating. It's not an arbitrary date, it's tied to a political calendar that doesn't wait. Now, here's a distinction that gets lost in most coverage of this bill, and it matters specifically if you're looking at assets like XRP, Stellar, or HBAR rather than Bitcoin. Bitcoin already has its regulatory clarity. It went through its own legal fights years ago, landed on commodity classification, and the SEC approved spot Bitcoin ETFs. Pension funds can already get regulated Bitcoin exposure today. The Clarity Act isn't really about Bitcoin. It's about everything Bitcoin isn't: smart contract platforms, tokenized real world assets, decentralized finance, cross border settlement infrastructure, the categories where XRP, Stellar, HBAR, Chainlink, and similar assets actually operate. One investment professional put it this way this week: most of the regulatory progress people are excited about doesn't touch Bitcoin's core thesis at all. It touches everything adjacent to it. That's a real structural point, not just industry talking point framing, because the technology in those categories genuinely needs a defined legal home before institutional capital can move into it at scale. There are 7 spot XRP ETF applications currently registered in the US. Financial institutions don't file ETF paperwork as a casual exercise. That's a real cost and compliance burden, and firms generally only take it on when internal analysis says approval is realistically within reach. The products are essentially built in waiting. What's missing is the legal framework that lets them actually launch and scale. While all of that legislative momentum has been building, Illinois did something that has nothing to do with any of it. Governor Pritzker signed a 0.2% tax on digital asset transactions into law, tucked into a 1,624-page revenue bill inside the state's $55.9 billion fiscal 2027 budget. It takes effect January 1st, 2027. The Crypto Council for Innovation called it the most punitive state-level digital asset tax in the country. And the reason isn't really the headline rate. 0.2% sounds small. It's the structure. This tax applies to the gross value of a transaction regardless of whether the trade made or lost money. A trader moving $500,000 a month through a covered platform owes $1,000 a month, $12,000 a year, win or lose. Out-of-state brokers get pulled into it once their Illinois-sourced business crosses $100,000 annually, which is a low enough bar to catch nearly every exchange with meaningful Illinois exposure, even ones with zero physical presence in the state. The industry comparison getting repeated most often is that no equivalent transaction level tax applies to stocks, bonds, or derivatives in Illinois. This is specifically aimed at crypto. A 16Z's head of policy compared it to taxing email, the criticism being that it targets a technology category rather than any actual risk profile. Chicago is home to firms like Jump Crypto and Bitnomial, and the realistic concern from industry groups is that this pushes exactly that kind of business towards states with friendlier treatment. The practical options for affected platforms are limited: eat the cost into Illinois customer pricing, or geo-restrict Illinois users entirely the same way exchanges already block sanctioned jurisdictions. Legal challenges are widely expected before 2027, but nothing's been filed yet that resolves anything. The thing worth sitting with here is that federal clarity and state-level tax policy aren't the same fight, and winning one doesn't touch the other. The Clarity Act, even passed in its best form, sets rules for what counts as a security, who regulates what, how digital asset businesses interact with federal law. It doesn't preempt a state's ability to tax transactions however it wants. A company could get every piece of regulatory clarity it's been asking Washington for and still get squeezed out of Illinois, specifically because that's a completely separate legislative track that federal action doesn't touch. There's also a political infrastructure piece worth understanding on its own terms, separate from the legislative mechanics. Fair Shake, a crypto focused PAC, spent $12 million backing Trump endorsed candidate Barry Moore in Alabama's Senate primary runoff, and Moore won. The PAC says it has nearly $150 million still on hand, which it describes as funding the largest pro crypto voting bloc in congressional history. That's their own characterization of what they're building, worth noting as their framing rather than an independently verified fact. What is verifiable is the $12 million spend and the win in Alabama. That's a real documented data point about how seriously the industry is now investing in who actually sits on the relevant committees rather than just lobbying whoever's already there. Anthony Scaramucci, who talks regularly with senators and people close to this process, gave a specific and appropriately hedged estimate. If the Clarity Act passes, he said he'd be considerably less worried about the industry's near-term path because it means bipartisan support got written into actual law. If it doesn't pass and a more adversarial SEC chair eventually replaces Paul Atkins, he expects that creates a real headwind, one he thinks is unwarranted but real nonetheless. His personal number: better than 50% odds this gets done before the end of July. That's an opinion from someone with genuine access, not a guarantee, and it should be read as exactly that. He also made a broader argument worth hearing on its own terms. He used Uber as the comparison. The taxi commission didn't want it, the mayor didn't want it, the medallion owners who'd invested in the old system actively fought it. None of that mattered because the people who used the product chose it anyway. And that demand eventually overwhelmed every institutional obstacle in its way. His argument is that the same dynamic applies here. Even in a worst-case political outcome, a genuinely better technology tends to win eventually. That's a real point. It's also an analogy that proves less than it sounds like it proves, because Uber's adoption ran through millions of individual daily consumers, making an obvious convenience trade-off. Institutional financial infrastructure runs through banks, fund managers, and compliance departments, making very different kinds of decisions on very different timelines. Whether the Uber pattern actually maps onto that is a separate question Scaramucci didn't really address, and it's worth holding that gap rather than smoothing over it. So here's where this actually leaves things without dressing it up. The Clarity Act has passed the House, cleared the Senate Banking Committee with bipartisan votes, and needs roughly 7 to 10 Democratic senators on top of the Republican caucus to clear a floor vote that hasn't happened yet. 3 people with real access to this process, Haggerty, Scaramucci, Armstrong, are independently pointing to a window before the end of July, which is a meaningful convergence, but still 3 opinions rather than 3 confirmed votes. The midterm calendar is the actual source of urgency because losing either chamber hands committee control to people who already voted no, and that's a multi-year setback, not a short delay. Separately, Illinois has already signed its own transaction-level crypto tax, regardless of what happens federally. A reminder that state policy runs on its own track that federal clarity doesn't override. And Fair Shake spending is real and documented, even if its own framing of what it's building deserves to be read as their characterization rather than settled fact. Do you think the Clarity Act actually clears the Senate before the end of July, yes or no? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to see where this audience actually lands. If this gave you a clearer, more grounded picture of where things stand, go ahead and like it and subscribe for the next update. Share it with someone who's only heard the optimistic version and doesn't know about the Illinois tax running on a completely separate track. Three insiders gave three independent estimates, and they all landed in the same window. That convergence is worth something, but it's still three opinions, not three votes. The actual vote count is what settles it, and that hasn't happened yet. Stay informed, stay positioned. I'll see you in the next one.